Excellent. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Frederick Winsness and I am with NetHope. And we want to welcome everybody to yet another NetHope Solutions Center webinar and in partnership with CRS and the ICT4D Conference. Today we have quite the impressive donor panel, and we're going to talk about data protection priorities and expectations. And this may be particularly important in the new world we're living in with COVID-19 and everything. We have quite the impressive panel today. We have representatives from DFID, the UK Department of International Development. We have from USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. We have Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation represented, Cloudera Foundation, and Digital Impact Alliance, or DIAL. And before we get the panel going here, we want to do a little bit of housekeeping. We want to make this as interactive as possible, so please open the chat window in Zoom. You do that by clicking the little chat icon on the bottom of your screen and follow along there. Please submit your questions and we will do a facilitated Q&A session towards the end of the hour. After the webinar today, the recording and the slides will be posted to the NetHope Solutions Center, and we would encourage everyone to go there and share that page with your colleagues or others that might be interested. And you will see an online survey pop up in your browser when we end the session today. So please take a minute to answer those questions. It'll help us improve these webinars as we go forward. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Sonia. Sonia is with Catholic Relief Services and manages the ICT4D Conference. And Sonia, it's a little sad today. We should have been in Abuja today and closing off the ICT4D Conference, but here we are. I guess it's a reasonable plan B. Over to you, Sonia.
Thank you very much, Frederick. Yes, so we're virtual today, yes, and it's a follow-up session from last year's donor panel, and particularly this time we want to focus on data protection, expectations, and priorities. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our expert speaker panel. We have Jane Mogeni. She's a looks at data responsibility at DFID. Michael Baker, a senior ICT advisor at USAID. Dr. Vincent Seaman, Senior Program Officer for the Polio Department at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Claudia Yuch, CEO and President at the Cloudera Foundation. And Laura Walker-McDonald, Senior Director of Insights and Impact at the Digital Impact Alliance, DIAL. So thank you all very much for joining us today and sharing your insights. May I please ask Jane to kick us off and share with you your thoughts on data protection risks and opportunities during the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you, Jane.
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you, Sonia and NetHope for organizing this session and inviting us to speak. It is incredibly timely, actually, and it's really a good opportunity to share to learn as we are all impacted or are responding to COVID-19 crisis in one way or another. To delve directly into the topic on what are the opportunities and risks on data protection in the COVID-19 crisis. As we all know, detailed and timely data is really critical to effectively fight COVID-19. One of the lessons we learned from the Ebola crisis in West Africa was that clear and timely data can really support a timely response and save lives. On the other hand, uncoordinated efforts can lead to several data systems, cause delays, and ultimately cost lives. Presently seeing increased use of digital tools and technologies. For example, to educate the public, we are getting SMSs from governments telling you wash your hands. We are also seeing technologies such as geolocation and artificial intelligence being used for contact tracing and to, for example, enforce quarantine. At the same time, we are seeing new partnerships between government, private sector, and humanitarian organizations, all as part of this concerted effort to contain the virus. COVID-19 has affected many countries, fragile and conflict countries, rural and urban populations, developed countries. It's really one of those things that the whole world is caught up in this at the moment. And all these countries, we have different capacities in terms of data protection. In Europe, for example, there's a GDPR. Some countries have laws, some don't. Some countries respect international frameworks, others don't. And as we know, health data is considered particularly sensitive, and specific guidelines should be implemented when processing it. So digital technologies that are being used will definitely have varying effects on the population, depending on these capacities about the laws and the rule of law. But I think, like in any crisis, any misuse or inappropriate use of data will most likely have an impact on the most vulnerable. In this case, I would probably be looking at vulnerable, the ones even I would probably looking at.
Jane, we're having a little bit of a problem hearing you. I don't know if this is something.
Vulnerable countries might not. Also, there's a lot of opportunities to increase efficiency in the response. There's a lot of benefits.
Yeah, Jane, unfortunately, it sounds like your internet connection is a little questionable.
Using data. This, as I said earlier, we might have misinformation. Raising priorities.
So, Sonia, can we move on to the next speaker, and we can try to fix Jane's connection in the meantime? Would that be okay? And I wonder if we actually lost Sonia too. I wonder if there's an issue with London today. Madeline, can you move on to the slide with Mikhail? And Mikhail, hopefully you're with us.
Yes.
And hopefully it looks like Sonia is back, and we'll work on with Jane on her connection. But why don't we let you take the floor, and we'll move on to your slide.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. Hello, everyone. My name is Mikhail Baker. I'm a senior ICT advisor with the U.S. Agency for International Development, and I'm going to talk about our recently launched digital strategy and how it may potentially help promote data protection and privacy, both at the policy and programmatic level in the countries where we work. So we launched our digital strategy last week, and it will elevate digital development topics, including data protection and privacy, data literacy, digital inclusion, and the digital economy. We aim, through the uptake of our digital strategy and the initiatives under it, to increase investments in data protection and privacy, both at the national policy level and the program and project level. At the program and project level, we frame our approach to data protection and privacy as responsible data use. This approach balances three things: data use, privacy and security, and transparency and accountability. The framework recognizes the huge potential that data have to impact development and humanitarian outcomes, while also recognizing that data comes with risks, especially for vulnerable individuals and groups. We will support partner governments in developing robust national level policies for data protection, privacy, and governance, while balancing privacy needs with cross-border data flow needs. Our priorities for data protection and privacy include doing no harm, protecting and safeguarding PII and sensitive data of our beneficiaries, increasing public trust in institutions, both public and private, because building trust leads to greater availability of data, which encourages use, accuracy, validity, etc. and increasing utilization of program and project data to inform interventions and research for adaptive management and for collaborative learning and adapting. Some of the data protection and privacy risks and threats that we see include data sharing without proper security, for example, sharing data in unsecured formats via email, national data protection and privacy policies that lack mechanisms for enforcement and redress, informed consent issues, including loose adherence to consent and consent obtained without subjects' complete understanding of how data will and could be used, and data localization policies impacting data sharing, e-commerce and digital trade, health, education, and other development sectors. When USAID undertakes programming that involves data collection on individuals, data protection and privacy measures must continue to be built in and appropriately budgeted for, both within programs themselves and within USAID's operational infrastructure. We hope implementing partners working in democracy, governance, and technology will be able to successfully advocate for and help their governments put in place appropriate data protection and privacy policies. We would like to see our implementing partners stand up their own responsible data policies and put these into practice. This includes tackling data protection and privacy from the human side and the technology side. On the human side, this means socializing the importance of responsible data practices, including the potential harms to individuals and groups in the event their data were to be compromised, developing standard operating procedures and protocols for data protection and privacy, building capacity of staff and partners to use data responsibly, budgeting for data protection and privacy at the program project level and organization level, and developing data management plans which outline data protection and privacy controls over the programmatic implementation lifecycle. We may see some changes in our acquisition and assistance rules that would require IPs to articulate how data will be generated and acquired, managed, described, analyzed, stored, shared, and preserved over the life cycle of a program project. And I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. On the technology side, this means using appropriate hardware and software cybersecurity measures to control access to data, sharing of data, and integrity of data. Determining where to securely store data, whether it be in a cloud or on a local server, and managing the risks in each storage scenario. For example, in sensitive data scenarios such as humanitarian response and democracy and governance, it may make sense to store data in a secure cloud versus an on-site server. USAID will encourage the governments, civil society, private sector, and local stakeholders in our partner countries to protect and use data responsibly by consistently striving for all data assets to have appropriate safeguards and to be high quality, standardized, and machine readable. We'll work with our implementing partners and national governments to navigate the complex ethical and legal issues that will arise. And as implementation of the 5-year USAID digital strategy ramps up, we'll likely introduce new resources, training, and acquisition and assistance rules to support these efforts. We're thinking about data protection and privacy across the agency. For example, my team, the development informatics team in the Center for Digital Development, it plans to develop a national level data protection and privacy policy resource for our USAID missions and implementing partners. We have a privacy team that is looking at considerations for data protection and privacy within the agency and other US government agencies. We have a cybersecurity team looking at ways to incorporate digital hygiene and cybersecurity into agency programming. And we have a CIO office that's working toward bolstering data protection and privacy in agency policy and systems. And I'd mentioned the CIO office is promoting development of data management plans across the agency, and some parts of the agency, including the USAID Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, already require data management plans for some of their awards, and we may see a scaling up of this if the acquisition and assistance rules are updated. Some resources we have to support implementing partners right now in pursuing data protection and privacy efforts include our USAID digital strategy, which articulates our vision to support an open, secure, reliable, and interoperable internet. Considerations for using data responsibly at USAID. This resource highlights key considerations and questions to ask in order to drive responsible data use at the programmatic level. The principles for digital development, and Laura Walker-McDonald may talk a little bit about these, but this is a great resource for implementing partners to apply digital development best practices to their project and activity design. And our digital investment tool. This is a facilitated tool that we developed to help our missions and implementing partners apply the principles of digital development to system planning and design. And it has 13 subject matter areas, including one devoted to data protection and privacy, and it overlaps with the thematic areas of the principles for digital development. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mikhail. And I hope we have London back. So Sonia, back to you. I think maybe we should try to go back to Jane, and if her connection is restored as well. Sonia, are you there? Looks like Sonia may have trouble coming off mute. Let's try Jane. Jane, when you go, and we'll get to your slides.
Hello, I'm back. So I was talking about the opportunities that are available at the moment. We have, benefits that could be directly for the individual in terms of getting timely and accurate information about COVID-19, information about how the disease is progressing, such as knowing, underlying conditions at risk groups, and this is information that could help you as an individual. We also have benefits with good data that organizations can deliver better services more efficiently and more timely. And more broadly, if we use data for good and for development, it can be used to spread to reduce the spread of the disease. It can be used to improve diagnosis. It can be used to prepare for studies. It can enhance research in healthcare and other areas that will benefit the larger public. And more broadly, for us as practitioners, it's really an opportunity to make investments in data protection practices that will support higher quality and safer interventions in the long term. It's an opportunity to strengthen health data systems that can, for example, improve disease surveillance and future outbreaks. It's also really an opportunity to build evidence and to learn. We are all impacted by this. It's an opportunity to share knowledge, what's working in various countries in terms of technology, what's working, what's not working, what can be improved. It's also an opportunity to raise awareness and to assist humanitarian organizations in ensuring that they comply with personal data protection standards in carrying out humanitarian activities. And broadly to the humanitarian community, it's really that opportunity to potentially look at developing standards and practices in the humanitarian sector for data protection practices. With all this, there's always as well risks. We have, if data is used inappropriately, real harm can really occur to people. Discrimination and exclusion is, for example, one of the harms that can really happen. And we have seen this happening presently, for example, in India, where PDF files with names and home addresses and travel history of individuals is published. And we have seen the effect of that on discrimination and exclusion of minority groups who are being prevented from accessing healthcare, or even just directly experiencing discrimination in the community. For example, US tech giant Google and Apple are planning to use an app for contact tracing. And what you ask yourself here is, what about the people without smartphones? It's most likely going to be the most vulnerable person who does not have a smartphone. Decisions are then going to be made that exclude these particular groups of people. And essentially, we are making decisions on inaccurate data. There's also other intangible harms, reputation damage, and we can create systems of surveillance. Location data is really revealing, and we are seeing this used in more and more in many countries to contain COVID-19. for example, in Korea, where the government has been tracking and posting online data on people who are, confirmed or suspected to be infected with the virus, and using, mega data sets to deduce a lot of information, credit card history. And one would really ask, is this the level of surveillance that we want to tackle the disease? And we have seen in Korea specifically, internet mobs have exploited this patient data to identify people and to harass them. We are also seeing these public-private partnerships between governments, companies, NGOs that are responding. And what I would ask here is, are we enhancing powers for dominant platforms? This is a real risk. Are we exacerbating risks associated with data harvesting and monetization of health information? Are we legitimizing privacy invasive services? These are questions that we would really need to think about in terms of risks. Yes, we are all facing a significant public health crisis. Technology and data is really important, and it will be key in fighting COVID. But it can also be used to promote rights and dignity, and these two should not be seen as two separate issues. Responses and measures that are adopted are going to have an effect and impact beyond the crisis. That's something that we need to bear in mind. And any harms that occur as a result of misuse of data can erode confidence beyond the response and actually destroy trust between people and the governments. And to conclude, one of the things we've learned from past crises is not to fall for quick fixes. You can uphold human rights and prevent harm and exploitation from populations. In the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, some health systems that were developed for data collection, for surveillance, were later used after the Ebola crisis to, for example, improve immunization. So it's really an opportunity to build those systems as well that can be used in the future. But it's really time to put those foundations and build good data practices that will create a lasting impact. Thank you.
Well, excellent. Thank you very much. I believe we may have Sonia back. Are you back with us, Sonia?
Yes, I am. So sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Yeah, I think this might be a London issue that we were both kicked out. Thank you, Jane, for your contribution, and also Mikkel, which brings us to our next speaker, which will be Vince from the Gates Foundation. And Vince will be sharing with us, sorry, I can't see the screen right now, data protection priorities, particularly with relevance to GIS data. So over to you, Vince. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so my name is Vince Seaman. I'm a Senior Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I will focus on spatial data for my talk here. And for the Gates Foundation, with all of our investments, there's a focus on open data, and we try and clarify the use restrictions on any data collected in a project upfront. And you know, everybody always agrees to things up front when they're wanting to get the money, but it's not always easy to enforce you know, those agreements at the end of the day. So it's a continuing challenge, but we continue to work on it. And my slides are a little bit out of order here, but it's okay. I'll get to this one shortly. But the story with the GIS data focus at the foundation started back in around 2011, when we were trying to eradicate polio from Nigeria, and we found that there was a great need for more accurate and detailed maps in the northern part of the country where polio was still endemic. And so we embarked on a fairly expensive program to actually go collect every name and location of every settlement and key points of interest in the northern half of the country. And this helped us eliminate polio from all accessible areas. So that was wonderful. It was a great data set. We found it had use in other areas. but it was collected largely without involvement from the government. Government was aware of the work, but they were not really part of it. And we knew that this was going to be a challenge if we ever wanted the government to benefit from this data. They needed to be really more of a partner and not a beneficiary. So this led to a project called Grid 3, which strives to collect this type of data. We call it reference data, spatial reference data. It involves settlement names, locations, administrative boundaries, key points of interest, and then modeled population using satellite imagery, settlement features, and microcensus data that can be used to provide a population layer at 100 meters resolution. And so the Grid 3 project seeks to support country governments in creating and validating those layers while building the capacity within the country to use, curate, and keep that data updated. And this Grid 3 project is active in about 5 countries in the African region right now. The slide you see right now is the common georegistry project that the Gates malaria team is working on. They're partnered with AEHIN in the Southeast Asian region. And this is really basically a similar type of project. It is focused on malaria and typically the health facility registry for countries, but they address basically all of the same types of data layers. And the goal is similar: to help the country standardize their spatial reference data and make sure that it's available for important health projects and other government projects. So these 2 projects are kind of symbolic of the foundation's work, even though we are somewhat siloed in that most of our projects have a program focus like polio or malaria. We try and make sure that the product or the benefits are broader than that. Another example is we have a capacity building grant with the WHO Afro Regional Office in Brazzaville. So this is to build geospatial capacity and technical awareness in the region. And they've established a regional GIS center in Brazzaville. I encourage you to go see that if you ever are in the country. And we have a focal point, GIS focal point, in every region country, one at the MOH and one at the WHO office. So if you're in any Afro country and you need to connect with somebody who knows about the geospatial resources in that country, you can ask for the GIS focal point at either of those agencies and you can get connected. One of the projects that the GIS Center and the Afro region is doing is that they're using the building footprints, which we've recently made available for all of sub-Saharan Africa, along with existing survey data to create a base population layer for the whole continent. And this is a work in progress, but it depends on being able to access geo-reference survey data from national statistics offices or other partners who've collected such data. And this is not easy, even for WHO or other government agencies. And sometimes these data are locked in the National Statistics Office, and it's very challenging to get it released. But we feel that this would have great value. So at the end of the day, we feel that this spatial reference data, it really should be a public resource. But it really can't be that unless governments are able to participate in their own data collection, validation, and have ownership over it so that they can, authorize basically the data for their country. And if they can do that, there's much greater chance for harmonization of data sets, less corruption, because people can't use different types of data to demonstrate, their cause. And we just feel that this is a resource that would benefit everyone. And the Gates Foundation has most of their data that we collect. We try and make it available on a site called Geopode, which I will share the reference on the chat. And I think my time's up, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vince. And also a good reminder to say that we will share all the slides afterwards as well, as long as with the recording and the links together as well. So our next speaker will be Claudia Jüch. She's the CEO and President of the Cloudera Foundation. And Claudia, I would like to ask you, what are your plans to aid implementing partners as they build their data protection capacity?
Thank you, Sonia, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Sonia, if you could go to the first slide. I wanted to start us, or the second slide, actually. I wanted to start us off. You may not have heard anything about the Cloudera Foundation yet. We are a relatively new foundation, and we focus exclusively on enabling nonprofits to use data technology and data analytics to have positive impact. We are not focused on a specific sector, nor a specific geography. When we select grantees, it's really about what impact can the use of data have, and how important is the use of data in a project overall. And so we are working very actively with our grantees, but also with other actors in the nonprofit sector. We were created in 2017 by a company of the same name, Cloudera. And even though we were created by a company, we are legally independent from that company and a recognized 501c3, which in the United States means we are a nonprofit private foundation. That's important to note because it means that we are not engaging in selling software or developing the market for the company, which is, I think, important to highlight. I think if you could go to the next slide, please. So I'm building a little bit on what Jane said earlier. I like to think about 3 layers when I think about data governance and managing data and using data responsibly. At the highest level, there are laws and regulations those are the things that we need to adhere to. It's true, some countries, there's, for example, GDPR. Other countries haven't enacted laws and regulations. But then there is a next layer of internal data policies and ethical principles. And that's where, if laws exist, you translate them into what's relevant for your own organization. This is more driven by your mission, by your values, by the vulnerable populations you are working with, whether we are talking about children or we are talking about refugees. It's also informed by kind of context and culture. And clearly, in many cases, we want to do better than what laws and regulations require. And then the next layer, and all of these layers interact with each other. How are these internal data policies and principles are being implemented and translated into active work through processes and workflows and technologies? And clearly, this is the layer where we are most active. But this also shows that data governance and security is really a team sport. It's something that the whole organization needs to look at and help with to implement it. And it is something that it really needs to kind of drive a whole organization in order so that we can get it right. We are seeing in cases such as COVID-19, to speak to what's happening around us right now, that sometimes we say, okay, some of these aspects are not as important, and that is a kind of a natural inclination in states of emergency, and that might sometimes be required. But ideally, every solution and every project needs to be designed with these in mind. And I think we saw in the response to Ebola that if that doesn't happen, it really creates problems, not only in the moment, but also later on. So this question of even thinking ahead of time, how are you addressing in the case of an emergency? What are your different options? How do you future-proof those strategies and policies if things such as COVID or other threats really happen? I think are critical. And the last aspect, or two last aspects that I want to highlight on this slide is, I mean, clearly the processes, workflows, and technologies need to be kind of right-sized or appropriate for the context, whether it's about a low-income country or kind of a specific sector. I think that is critical. And I think it was one of the questions that came already through the chat. A lot of times I find when we are talking with potential grantees that donors are, since often we are funding things that are directly related to specific projects, it's very hard really to get support for this kind of full system that's required to really govern data effectively and most responsibly. Moving to the next slide. I was saying earlier, we are first and foremost a technical partner, but we clearly in that context are also acting as a thought partner for the nonprofits that we are working with, or nonprofits that are consulting us. And I think what is very important to us is to really think about the use of data and the management of data in a holistic way. Some of the panelists today, I think, did that very well, but often in the conversation that we are having outside of this webinar, I think people are focusing on one step of the data life cycle and are kind of thinking about how can they make that step most secure and really govern particularly well. But I think it's truly critical to really think this through along the full life cycle of data. So one example, data collection. For example, survey data collected on a tablet, maybe even collected still in a paper ledger. What is the security as this data is collected and then being transferred into a database? And are we thinking about kind of the encryption within the database, or are we also thinking about encryption in transit as the data is being moved from different storage buckets? Another element, I mean, also someone kind of referred to it in the chat, data breaches. They are, I think, clearly the worst that can happen, and they are, but intentionally malicious. But what about accidental misuse or corruption of data? How can you implement different authorization means in the, for example, process and analyze phase to make sure that doesn't happen? We are holding workshops. We held a workshop a couple of months ago, for example, in Geneva, focused on data for health. And there we were using, for example, the data life cycle, but also the data theory of change exercises, as we called them, to really think through the risks at each step of the way. And there are significant risks, as you saw from Jane's presentation. But often we also have means to mitigate those risks and to really think that through the different stages. Going to the last slide, our goal really is to make it as safe as possible while still enabling a kind of a purposeful use of the data to have positive impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Now I'd like to introduce Laura from Dial and like to ask her, I know Mikhail already mentioned the digital principles. If you can talk a little bit more, particularly what they mean in reality, and give some practical advice based on what we've heard so far. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and thanks for the invitation to join, and really glad to be here. Some very interesting reflections. I'm looking forward to the Q&A as well. I'm Laura Walker-McDonald, and as Sonia said, I'm at the Digital Impact Alliance Dial. We are a multi-stakeholder alliance hosted by the United Nations Foundation and supported by the donors on the call today, in addition to CEDA. And we are also the stewards of the Principles for Digital Development. And you see the link there on the screen to the website for the principles. And those, if you haven't come across them, the principles are a set of 9 living guidelines for how to design an ethical and more successful digital project. So they emerged from the sort of discussions that were being had by digital development practitioners 5 or 10 years ago about, continually seeing us making the same mistakes. And through a sort of lively community process over a number of years, boiled that down to 9 things that we really need to bear in mind, which include addressing privacy and security. So if you click on the link, you'll find a host of resources, including a suite of resources specifically for donors around implementing the digital principles. They are managed also by an advisory council drawn from the user community. And we have also a community site, and I think you can see in the continued debates about when we're going to add a 10th principle and what it should be, that they continue to enjoy really strong ownership from the community, which we really love. And we also are seeing an explosion in endorsement. So as an organization, you can endorse the digital principles, which essentially means putting there's a number of steps which we can share. And if anybody's interested, let me know in the chat, and I'm happy to follow up with you. At time of speaking, I believe we had 215 endorsers, which is up from 100 just a couple of years ago. Our 100th endorser was actually DFID. And what that means, I think, is that more and more organizations are trying to make this part and parcel of how they work, including a number of donors. For that reason, we're not rushing into a sort of revision of the principles, because we think people need to have the time to really put them into their practice. But that doesn't mean that we don't recognize that there's more to do. And I have a background in among other things, in accountability and monitoring and evaluation. And from that perspective, for example, I would say that the principles are really very useful at design stage. But when you go through the project cycle for a development implementation, they don't always sort of address then more long-term aspects of what the impact is and how we are accountable to the people who are affected by the program. So we were looking this year already at a number of developing resources and we're underway developing resources, not to question the value of the principles, which we are absolutely committed to, but rather just to say, as you're using the principles, here are a couple of other things that you might want to bear in mind. One of them was accountability and monitoring evaluation. Another was leaving no one behind, and the relationship between the principles and vulnerability. And another was actually responsible data. And we did that because when we look at some of the key tenets of responsible data, like justice and like these longer term accountabilities and responsibilities that data processors and data holders have to data subjects, to the people that data is about, the principles in themselves don't really point you to those longer term structures and programs. So you'll see us publishing, we are actually this week running and in the subsequent weeks webinars around implementing the principles in your COVID response. But one of the resources we will be coming out with later this year is around extending the principles. And as you think about the principles in your program, what do you have to do additionally to really cover responsible data? So they are very much living resources. And the other thing is, you often see others reflecting on how the principles play out and using them as guidance and testing them and proposing changes. And we try to reflect that as much as possible. So if you see one of those and you don't think that we're highlighting it, then do send it over to us and we'd be very glad to promote it. I also just wanted to reflect on a few themes that come up for me through the discussion. In addition to stewarding the principles, DIAL also hosts a community of practice for digital donors. We meet about monthly and discuss a range of deep dives on various topics. For example, yesterday we spoke in some depth about cybersecurity and had a really fascinating discussion about that. And then also in our programmatic work at country level, we try to be the connective tissue that helps bring partners together to implement some of the types of programs that have been discussed today, using private sector data for public policy decision making, and really bringing together technical practitioners and service providers with government departments and regulators and mobile network operators to try and help make some of those programs possible. And one of the things that we have been looking at through our sort of support of the donors community of practice is, or one of the things that comes up there is this issue of donor harmonization and how donors can better align strategies for ethical use of data. And the question was posed in the chat, you know, how far do you think the principles could actually be a guideline for donors, or could be supportive in starting to harmonize across the sector? And, you know, I mean, we don't have any formal sense of that. And actually the principles in some ways, because they are guidelines and they are fairly high level, are not designed to be enforceable as such. But we are starting to see them in donors procurement guidance. For example, they are quite cited in different smart rules for procurement, and others are starting to do the same. They do appear in the USAID strategy and such. And we also have developed various benchmarks to show what following some of these principles does look like in practice. And again, I would urge you to go to the website to find those. So I think in some senses, it is already happening. We were talking, for example, yesterday about cybersecurity, and one of the imperatives was that we not, as donors, or donors do not mandate grantees to adhere to different standards. And so if we do start mandating a particular approach to responsible data, let's try and make sure that it is aligned so that people don't have different requirements from different donors. And I think that feeling could also be true for governments, because obviously governments are dealing with multiple donors on any given response, and particularly something as large as this one. I think also it's important to bear in mind where governments are with some of this. It's been mentioned a couple of times that often there aren't robust privacy and security regimes around data. In fact, in many ways, there are very few jurisdictions in the world where data is really robustly governed. I think, therefore, when we're trying to start some of these data programs, we are doing so in countries where they really don't have legislative and regulatory frameworks that act as guardrails to protect vulnerable people and you know, sort of govern the use of data and things like that. So we don't think that necessarily means you must not do it. And in fact, you know, in some cases, we are working with countries where those regulatory frameworks aren't there yet, but there is the intention to put them in place. In the absence of that, how can we work with implementers and with governments to make sure that we're doing risk-benefit analysis and weighing the potential risks against the potential benefits, doing ethical reviews, looking at really whether the theory of change hangs together. And we've had some success also doing dark logic models or dystopian theories of change exercises, where we think if the absolute worst thing were to happen as a result of this idea, what would be the impact? And these simple sort of exercises and discussions can be very helpful in trying to identify where we want guardrails to be. Just another couple of quick thoughts. Another thing that came up was thinking about capacity at government level and implementer level, both short term but also long term. So if we're putting into place programs that use data in these ways, is there a way to have it be sustainably managed over time? If we leave those infrastructures in place, will they still be governed well after the emergency is over and the government is maybe taking over the program? The other thing I just wanted to raise quickly was that it's possible that donors might be able to coordinate in country sooner than they can at the global level. So that's something to bear in mind. And I think overall, you know, something that I would ask for and feel very strongly about is that there is a real opportunity here to transparently share our mapping and assessment and hypotheses about how we're using data and the frameworks we're using to try and understand and govern them. And that by sharing openly, we both reduce duplication of effort, but also can learn from one another. There was a USAID actually published a paper that I will share the link to in the chat, Fighting Ebola with Information after the Ebola response. And it's a really useful, almost real-time review of what was happening in terms of communications in that emergency. And you see that then picked up and used in their subsequent and also very useful guidance that has been linked already, which is the considerations for using data responsibly for COVID-19, which I really recommend. And that really transparent learning is critical. And I think that we have a real opportunity here in this emergency to commit to openly sharing the learning from what happens, so that we are better prepared for the next thing that happens that's like this. Ebola felt unprecedented at the time. Here we are dealing with another unprecedented emergency. And hopefully, if we can learn from it together, then we can reflect and prepare better for the next one. I think I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you very much to the attendees for posting your questions. We still have time to take a few more. So I'd like to address the first question to Jane, and it's about the GDPR. I know this wasn't necessarily an area you talked about, but the question in particular is, since the GDPR has impacted DFID grantees heavily in 2019, as they have worked to catch up on the data security and privacy protections enshrined in the GDPR, do you have any advice for NGOs, particularly any that focus on youth or childcare, and who tend to have generally lower resources, how they can build their own responsible data policies and practices in the light of GDPR? Are there any resources we can share with them, or do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. There's several resources out there, and I also probably forgot to mention that DFID is actually currently working on its own kind of data responsibility guidance that would be provided to partners. We do recognize that resourcing has been one of the big issues, and we're trying to see how we can best address that through available platforms with other donors. We are trying to coordinate across the board with other donors to ensure that when we are talking about data responsibility, we're using the same language. We are not creating an additional burden for the partners, and we do recognize resourcing is really important, because without that, then really it's all going to fall flat. So I would say yes, there's a lot of resources out there, and I could share some after this. We're doing a lot of research and evidence learning, which is also available to see for partners to see and see what others have done. Yeah, so I'll be able to share that on the link afterward.
Thank you very much, Jane. We also have a question. It's for all speakers, but I will ask Claudia to maybe answer this question first. What do you think are the risks to an organization with regards to relationship between the organization and the donor if they were to experience a data breach, despite taking responsible measures to protect the data?
It's a good question. I mean, in many cases, from what I've seen in terms of grant agreements, donors kind of, protect themselves from any liability. I think what is important in those cases, I think, is really for the nonprofit to be able to demonstrate that they have taken the necessary precaution. I also would say that, to the extent that the donor can assist the nonprofit in kind of developing and building the capacity to detect and prevent data breaches, I think that would also be something that would be helpful in the sector. But ultimately, this is really, I think, first and foremost, something that the organization is affected by, and clearly, a critical aspect.
Thank you very much. We also had a number of questions regarding specific tools. So tools used for ethical reviews, or alternatively, there's also a question for data collection tools. So whether open source platforms for data collection are a good idea. So maybe with regards to tools, could I maybe ask Vince your comment on this, and then I'll see if anybody else wants to add to this.
Sure, sure. So, I mean, we don't require our grantees or partners to use any specific tools, although we highly recommend that they use open source tools or software. Many of our partners use ODK for data collection. Some use an ONA platform for their hosting their data, but it's very rare that we would use a proprietary platform, because we know that's not really sustainable in the long run. So really everything should be readily accessible for anyone without the need for licensing or anything like that.
And Sonia, I would like to add to that. I neglected to mention earlier that one of the mandates under our digital strategy is for digital data collection by default. And people can learn more about that in the digital strategy, but basically it means that data should be collected using digital means. I'll also say that we don't select or push digital data collection applications onto our implementing partners. That choice is typically left to them. We know that partners are using open source digital data collection applications such as ODK, which Vince mentioned, Kobo Toolbox, ComCare, DHIS2, and others, and many are using proprietary tools as well.
And Sonia, this is Laura, I just wanted to weigh in on the ethical tools front, if that's all right.
Yes, yes,
just
please
to suggest do. That, thank you. Yeah, just to say that there are now a range of really helpful handbooks on responsible data out there. The Center for Humanitarian Data at OCHA has one for humanitarian response, for example, and last year USAID also launched guidelines, both of which are very helpful. We at DIAL have an internal process where we try to link our assessments into the planning process and into our project management based risk management process. So tying it very carefully to theories of change. And at the outset and throughout the project, we also conduct and then maintain a risk benefit analysis assessment, which we write with partners, and that requires us to really look at how, what may arise as a result, and is the benefit worth the potential harms, things like that. So we're going to be sharing those resources soon with everyone, because we feel that it's sometimes difficult to have that pathway in your head of what steps to take. And I think that that sort of partnership with others to make sure that so many different partners in a chain may have their own approach to testing this, and so I think having that conversation as a team with the inevitable group of people that it takes to pull off a data analysis program is really important.
Thank you very much, Laura. I know we have a lot of more questions, but if I may, what I will do is share those questions with the speakers afterwards and see if we can get some more answers or links to resources, because we're already, unfortunately, at the end of our webinar. So that leaves me to, again, thank the speakers for sharing your insights, to the attendees for your time and questions, and of course to NetHope for facilitating this webinar for us. We will reconvene on this platform on May 5th, when we have a webinar on digital tech to help fight COVID-19 misinformation. And we also have other virtual events coming up, a partnership with the Global Digital Development Forum on May 6th, which is a 16-hour event with ICT4D content across all different global regions. So the link will be shared here as well. And on May 13th, we're talking about how we tailor malaria interventions during COVID-19. And yeah, many more opportunities to share information coming up in the future months. So Again, thank you very much for joining us. And before you log off, please do fill out the webinar feedback poll so we can hear what you thought about this or any advice on how we can improve any future events. Thank you and goodbye.
Sonia, thank you very much. I also posted the link to where you can find the recordings later on, and there'll be a follow-up email. So watch your inbox and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you for the interaction. Thank you very much to Sonia for producing this and to the panelists today. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.